The black sheep of Asia. People commonly refer to the Philippines as the black sheep of Asia, Filipinos included. People also commonly refer to the Philippines as less like our geographic Southeast Asian neighbors than like the predominantly Catholic, formerly Spanish colonized, often culturally Americanized Latin American countries. Academic scholarship on the Philippines takes largely the same position, working from the assumption that the Filipino self-image is historically non-Asian, seeing itself as belonging instead to the Western Hemisphere. To wit, early post-war and Cold War scholarship excluded the Philippines entirely from studies of Southeast Asia, as if it were not a part of the region at all. But has this always been the case? And what do these assumptions elide about what may be our more complex, multivocal, and evolving national identity in history? Today, I will argue that the idea that the Philippine nation and people are explicitly Asian was deeply central to the concept of the Philippine nation when it first emerged, as well as to the political argumentation and revolutionary organizing undertaken in the name of sovereignty for that new nation. First, a bit of background. The important global moment of the late 19th to early 20th century, with all the changes in technology, sovereignty, human exchange, and ideology that it brought, is too often apprehended in Asian historiography through a bilateral framework privileging relations with the West. Sure, the interaction between the West and the East was important, and we always hear about the West interacting with itself, but there is also an East-East narrative as well, and a narrative that takes place entirely between the colonized nations alone, that our history of the period barely acknowledges. The long Philippine Revolution, which began against Spain and continued against the United States of America, took place against a backdrop of imperial incorporation and local resistance that was truly region-wide. I don't have time to acknowledge each of these contemporaneous histories, but these slides will allow you to imagine the canvas of hardening empires and quickening local resistance that enveloped Southeast Asia at this time. This era also saw the emergence of Japan as a non-Western imperial power. This is important to the story because the last quarter of the 19th century saw a global increase of violence, monopoly capitalism, and direct colonial rule that was bound up in the intensified Western imperial struggle to partition the world, which greatly increased the sense of insecurity in the rest of the world. Pan-Asianism, which emanated centrally from Japan and China, advocated Asian solidarity under the aid of Japan against the encroachments of Western imperialism, internalizing a loose belief in a vague evolutionary social Darwinism in which mutual aid and cooperation among those of like races and cultures would allow for better competition in what they perceived to be a global competition of survival of the fittest among nations. Mainstream, Sino-centric East Asian Pan-Asianism also hinged on an understanding of a common destiny in an Asian struggle against Western imperialism, and at times against Westernization or even modernization. This idea of a common destiny was the intellectual vehicle that Southeast Asian Pan-Asianists used to enlarge in Japanese Pan-Asianism to include Filipinos, Vietnamese, and other members of oppressed Asia beyond just the East Asian Sinic world. Indeed, my dissertation showed that the revolutionary First Philippine Republic's foreign collaboration represents the first instance of fellow Pan-Asianists lending material aid toward anti-colonial revolution against a Western power and harnessing transnational Pan-Asian networks of support, activism, and association toward doing so. But why would this be the case if the Philippines did not consider itself Asian? Today, my talk will unpack the role that Asia played at this pivotal moment of Philippine history in order to correct our overly narrow understanding of Philippine history. There were alternate visions of world order to challenge that of the Western imperial framework, and alternative modernities to that which the West offered. And the reason why the Philippines was ultimately drawn to these is also important to note, for what it tells us about the international framework of power and race that underpinned this transnational moment in Southeast Asia at the turn of the 20th century. The moment of the birth of the Filipino nation is the late 19th century, when the ilustrados, or the educated elite, constructed it, and the Philippine Revolution organized it, leading briefly to the first modern secular republic in all of Asia. Prior to this active work, the very term Filipino meant a Spaniard born in Las Filipinas. I mention this to illustrate how necessary it was to construct the concept of a Filipino. It was not simply assumed. The Ilustrados propaganda movement, which worked centrally through their European-based newspaper La Solidaridad, inscribed the new Philippine nation within a more ancient Asian landscape, imbued with civilizational importance, recognizable even to the Europeans, rather than arising simply on an island with no visible ancient ruins or historical grandeur. The propagandists apparently thought this older association necessary with a richer, documented civilizational realm due to the visible lack of ancient kingdoms around which Filipinos could assemble their own unique Filipinized nationalism. For example, the propaganda sought to recover their Tagalog language, a member of the Malayo-Polynesian linguistic family, as a marker of autonomy and identity. Eschewing the Roman alphabet, the propagandists developed a Tagalog orthography, or spelling system. Jose Rizal wrote to Mariano Ponce excitedly in 1888. The new Tagalog orthography and writing system we are using is perfectly in accord with the ancient writing and with the Sanskrit origin of many Tagalog words as I have found them in the British Museum. Thus, this act of recovery succeeded not only in effecting a symbolic separation from Spain, but also restored Tagalog to its pre-colonial Asian world. In La Solidaridad, Asia largely appears as constructed through the history of civilization, with a capital C, and is noted for its heights of achievement, albeit in a defensive tone. An important feature in this construction of Asia through the history of civilization was the premise that there is something like universal civilization, and that it merely passed from one incarnation to another, from east to west and back again. This ephemeral, unitary concept of civilization formed the mechanism by which the Ilustrados could reconcile the current state of material inequality between the East and the West, and the rise and fall of great powers. It is interesting to note that this is precisely the theoretical premise that would later characterize President Jose P. Laurel's historical and political thinking, and that grounded his Pan-Asianism in the 1920s and 1940s. Filipino nationalist writings of the period commonly referred to Filipinos as belonging to the Malay race. This emphasis on being part of the Malay race was a way to counter Spanish and European thinkers who described the archipelago as overrun by an anarchy of tribes and races. Rizal declared himself to be Malayo Tagalog, and in his 1890 annotations to the scholarship of Antonio de Morga, explored hypotheses of shared racial and civilizational origins for Filipinos with Sumatrans, Polynesians, and even Japanese. Rizal's Paris-based organization Indios Bravos agreed on a secret agenda of liberating first the Philippines, then Borneo, Indonesia, and then Malaya. Facing Spanish persecution, Rizal spent a week in 1892 traveling through Sandakan, Borneo, in present-day Malaysia, to seek a land grant from the British government to establish a Filipino colony, at home amongst their purported racial brothers. Writing from Paris in 1888, Filipino painter Juan Luna wrote Jose Rizal, "Tell me about your travel impressions, especially about your stay in Japan, whose people is so attractive to me. I'm an enthusiastic admirer of their painting, and I think that it is as advanced as that of Greece and Italy. We should study more that country, whom we resemble so much." In contrast to the Ilustrados' desire to claim the Japanese as their racial brothers, the ethnic Chinese commercial minority in Las Filipinas was a target of prejudice. There are repeated references in La Solidaridad to differences between the Malay Filipinos and their Cynic neighbors in Asia, particularly regarding Cynic vice. Meanwhile, Marcelo H. del Pilar asserted in a famous 1890 article that the Spanish government itself recognized racial similarity and affinity not only between the Filipinos and other Malays, but also with the Japanese. Fearing the Filipinos to deal frequently with other individuals of their own race who were free and independent, as the Borneans, the Siamese, the Cambodians, and the Japanese, people who in their customs and feelings differ greatly from the Chinese, the government acted toward these others with great mistrust and great severity. Thus, in this interpretation, the Chinese stood apart from the rest of Asia, while the Japanese stood with Southeast Asians and Filipinos racially and culturally, even though they were integrated members of the Cynic world. The inclusion of the Japanese, but not the Chinese on these terms, seems a difficult paradox to reconcile, particularly given the mixed Chinese ethnicity of the propagandists themselves, except through the propagandist desire to aggrandize the Filipino by claiming the Japanese as among their racial kind, while holding a status superior to the pure, culturally unassimilated Chinese immigrants in their midst, in the same manner that the Spanish did. While employing race as a category and treating races as real, the Ilustrados argued against a fixed ranking of the races, arguing instead for a multilinear evolutionism rather than a deterministic orthogenetic Darwinism. However, as we can see, their use of racial categories had its own hierarchizing logic and involved responses to Western practices of ranking that only served to legitimize the framework of that hierarchizing, as their complex relationship with their own Chinese and animist Filipino tribal brothers illustrates. La Solidaridad reinforced the idea that Filipinos were Malay. An 1895 article proudly declared, "The Japanese are Malay and the Filipino inhabitants are Malay." La Solidaridad also hotly challenged any suggestion that the Filipinos were not Malay. Mariano Ponce dedicated an article to the Spanish writer Vicente Barrantes, and in it wrote, "His Excellency has the nerve to say that the Malay element is not exclusive, not even preponderant in the Philippines. To what race, then, do the Filipinos belong? All ethnographers of the world will be grateful to His Excellency if he were to surprise us with the news that the natives, with the exception of the Negritos, do not belong to the Malay race. And not only the scholars would be grateful, but even the children of the primary schools of Austria and Germany, because they know from their teachers." The deep offense taken at Barrantes' assertion reveals just how much the Ilustrados' civilizational and racial pride depended upon their identification with the Malays. It also underscores the instability of these racial constructions and how global hierarchies and international perceptions of civilizational achievement were deeply implicated in their constructed nationalism, even as the Ilustrados claimed to disavow them. Indeed, the easy disavowal of the Negritos, which was the term at the time for the Philippines' animist indigenous peoples in the mountains in Ponce's article, evidences the implicit workings of an internalized sense of hierarchy. The Negritos of the Philippines were either a liability to the Ilustrados' quest to win political and civilizational recognition, or an easy instrument by which to shore up their own racial superiority, a way to say to Europe, "Nuance your denigration of Filipinos. Your stereotype may fit them, but not us." The Katipunan, the secret society that would begin the Philippine Revolution upon the failure of the propaganda movement that came before it, was the direct intellectual inheritor of this work by the propaganda movement to construct an Asian Philippine nation. And one finds precisely this kind of theoretical argumentation, emphasis on the Philippines' Asian heritage, and turn towards Japan as a new symbol of power in the writings, initiation rites, and private letters of the Katipuneros and the revolutionaries of the First Philippine Republic. As revolutionaries and anti-colonial thinkers faced increasing Spanish crackdown in Las Filipinas, they moved to Hong Kong, Singapore, and especially Yokohama, where they would harness anti-colonial Pan-Asianist networks in an attempt to aid the Philippine Revolution. So let's close this discussion by tallying what these overseas revolutionaries' Asianist organizing was like in order to get a sense of Pan-Asianism in motion. This was not all solidarity, unity, and brotherhood. Pan-Asianism was a romantic fantasy and trafficked in emotionality and bonds of friendship, upon which the networks of aid and political organizing rested, but it was grounded in power calculations and instrumentalized by those in colonized Southeast Asia for nationalist purposes first and foremost. In the newly racialized geopolitical and intellectual framework, the colonized believed this racial solidarity necessary to their political projects. So, Bonifacio sent delegates to negotiate with the Japanese government to obtain firearms. The Japanese Duke and the Admiral of the Congo and Consul in Manila agreed to sell arms to the Katipunan. They organized a reception for the Japanese Admiral upon his arrival in Manila. Emilio Jacinto asked Japan to play the role that France did to the US during its War of Independence. There are accounts from several Katipuneros that Bonifacio offered Japan protectorate status over the Philippines. One account claims that Bonifacio agreed that Mindoro would be handed over to Japanese control, though Bonifacio did not verify this. Japanese Minister Okuma obtained permission from the US government for military shishi Captain Tokizawa to accompany US troops in the Philippines as an observer. Although in the Philippines with the Americans, Tokizawa freely passed a lot of sensitive information back to the Filipino revolutionaries, including the fact that he was told the Americans would attack Manila 3 days hence. In 1898, once Aguinaldo was setting up his government in the First Philippine Republic, he named former propagandist Mariano Ponce the Philippines' foreign emissary to Japan, a mission that ranked 4th out of 28 budget items of the Aguinaldo government. Ponce lived in Japan from June 1898 to March 1901. He met Japanese officials and persons of all levels, and joined and attended meetings of various Asianist societies, including the Oriental Young Men's Society, which included Koreans, Chinese, Japanese, Indians, Siamese, and Filipinos as members, and gained the patronage of prominent Japanese politicians. Within the society, the problems of Korea and the Philippines were topics of active discussion. In Japan, Ponce met the Chinese Confucian scholar Kang Yue, who led the 100 Days of Reform, the exiled leaders of the Korean Reform Movement, the Korean government, and Prince Park Yong-kyo, as well as the Chinese revolutionary and future president of the Republic of China, Sun Yat-sen, with whom he became lifelong friends. Ponce fielded individual Japanese supporters to train the Philippine Revolutionary Army. Several Japanese volunteers sailed to the Philippines to train Aguinaldo's army along with arms and ammunition. The Hong Kong Committee was also successful in procuring arms for the First Philippine Republic. But Ponce's stay in Japan was a success mostly in terms of delivering intelligence to the Hong Kong-based junta of the Philippine Revolutionary Government, and in shaping foreign Asian opinion on the rightness of the Philippine Revolution. His work, Cuestión Filipina, was published several times in Japan and Shanghai. The scholar Rebecca Carl argues that for Chinese intellectuals, it was this piece by Ponce that first persuasively cast colonialism as a global discursive problem, a characterization that not only facilitated the universalization of the Philippine national experience well beyond its particularities, but one that endured well beyond the duration of the Philippine situation itself. Indeed, you have Asian leaders as late as Sukarno referencing the Philippine Revolution and Rizal as inspiration. Apolinario Mabini published an important article in 1899 in which he declared that the revolution had as its sole objective and final goal the aspiration to maintain alive and bright in Oceania the torch of liberty and civilization, so that illuminating the gloomy night in which today the Malay race lies debased and degraded, the revolution will show the road to its social emancipation. Written by Aguinaldo's closest advisor and the First Philippine Republic's Minister of Foreign Affairs, this is the strongest statement we have on the deeply racial, interpretive framework and pan-Malay vision that were operative in the Philippine Revolution. Though the Philippine Revolution eventually ended unsuccessfully, Asianism continued to inspire certain pockets of Filipino discourse and the world of ideas, albeit from the sidelines. Yet the distinct mode of critique and alternative visions of cosmopolitanism, modernity, and world order that Pan-Asianism represented were neither unimportant nor short-lived in Southeast Asia. Not only did they abet and inform what would become the post-war discourses of Third Worldism and Pan-Malayism in the Philippines, but they are also embedded in the very foundations of the Filipino nation.